This right here is the Nintendo GameCube. Time to review it. When people think of the GameCube, they think of it as a commercial failure, a console that should be buried deep into Nintendo's past. I personally think that despite not being the most successful Nintendo console, it's one hell of an underrated console, that's for sure. When this little guy released in 2001, it was actually a surprisingly capable console. In terms of graphical power, it was basically put in between the PS2 and the Xbox. So it had some pretty decent specs under the hood. Unfortunately, due to a variety of factors, which we'll talk about later in this video, the Nintendo GameCube lagged well behind its competition. But almost 20 years later, it's a very sought after console with many incredible games. Let's talk about some personal backstory with the GameCube. So, the Nintendo GameCube was my first home console. I first got one, I think, around 2005, and I played a heck of a lot of it when I was growing up. Many of my favorite games I played on it were Super Smash Bros. Melee, SpongeBob SquarePants the movie, Shrek Extra Large, which is a surprisingly terrible game, don't recommend it, Need for Speed Underground, Need for Speed Hot Pursuit 2, Nicktoons Unite, and the list goes on. Unfortunately, due to the GameCube using tiny little mini discs, I had a tendency of losing a lot of my games growing up, which was very heartbreaking. But it is what it is. Alright, let's show off more of the console, shall we? So, on the top of the console, we have the Nintendo logo, of course, along with the Nintendo GameCube logo in this big black circle right in the middle of the disc tray, which is the exact same size as the little mini DVDs that the Nintendo GameCube takes. We also have our power button, reset button, and the open button. You're probably wondering, what in the world is this thing right here on the top? Well, guess what? It's a handle. That's right, Nintendo put a freaking handle on their home console. Because of its size, I mean, it kind of makes sense. You can just easily carry it with you wherever you go. And it's surprisingly well built too, so I can just sit here and really shake the hell out of it and it just stays intact. It's surprisingly well made. On the left side of the console we have the cooling fan, which is surprisingly quiet. And on the right side we have an intake vent. On the front of the console we have 4 controller ports, just like the Nintendo 64 had before the GameCube, along with 2 memory card slots. On the bottom of the GameCube we have a slew of expansion ports. First one is the high-speed expansion port. This one was used for an expansion called the Game Boy Player, which allowed you to play Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and even Game Boy Advance games through your GameCube and play them on your television. That's sick. Unfortunately, the Game Boy Player is pretty sought after nowadays and can be quite expensive, especially the boot disc, because the boot disc is required to run the actual Game Boy Player itself. And then this one, which is the serial port number 1, this one was used for the LAN adapter for the GameCube. That's right, the GameCube was online play capable, except there weren't a whole lot of games that used it. 2 that come to mind are Phantasy Star Online and Mario Kart Double Dash, and that's about it. Nintendo wouldn't really take online play more seriously until the Wii came along. And then finally we have the serial port 2, which was used for nothing. That's right, this port wasn't used for anything. It was actually phased out in later GameCube models. Although, thanks to the modding scene, they've actually made SD card adapters for this specific port, so you can actually play backups straight from an SD card, which is awesome. On the back of the GameCube we have AC power, analog AV, and digital AV. Analog AV was used for composite and S-video, but digital AV was used for component video. Unfortunately, the component cables for the Nintendo GameCube are incredibly expensive nowadays because, 1, they were only sold on Nintendo's official website, which back in the early 2000s there weren't nearly as many people using the internet as there are now. And number two, the actual cable itself used a chip that did all of the video processing, which made it incredibly expensive to make. But luckily nowadays, modders have been able to reverse engineer the actual chip inside of the component cables, and now you can buy HDMI adapters for the specific port for way less than actually buying the component cables themselves. Remember when I mentioned earlier that there were a variety of factors that hampered the Nintendo GameCube's success? Well, unfortunately, one of them was the storage medium that it used. Sure, it was Nintendo's very first optical media capable system, but instead of going with regular DVDs, they decided to go with a proprietary mini DVD format, which only held about 1.2 to 1.4 gigabytes per disc, compared to 4.7 to 8.5 on a regular DVD. So because of that, developers had to find ways to work around the Nintendo GameCube's storage limitations, which would include cutting content on their games, compressing audio and video files, and even splitting games onto multiple discs. Another factor that hampered the Nintendo GameCube's success was the way it looks. Compared to the Xbox and PS2, a lot of people looked at the GameCube and just saw it as a kid's console. I mean, I guess I can kind of understand what they were coming from, especially looking at the launch console, the Indigo one, which is the one I have. But still, come on. Don't judge a book by its cover. Alright, let's move on to a more positive light. Let's talk about the specs of the GameCube. What is powering this little guy? So for CPU, it's got a 32-bit IBM PowerPC 750CXE Gecko chip clocked at 486 MHz. For memory, we have 24 megabytes of 1T SRAM clocked at 324 MHz. That's the system RAM. And then we also have 3 megabytes of embedded 1T SRAM for the video RAM. And then along with that, we have 16 megabytes of DRAM for the I/O buffer RAM. For storage, the GameCube uses proprietary memory cards with 16 megabytes being the maximum capacity. The GameCube supports composite video, S-video, RGB SCART, and component/D terminal. For a graphics chip, it has an ATI Flipper GPU clocked at 162 megahertz. For sound, the GameCube only supports analog stereo, although it does have support for Dolby Pro Logic 2. And finally, for power, the GameCube can run on a measly 46 watts. That's impressive. We cannot forget talking about the GameCube controller because it is absolutely legendary. And here it is. Although this is not the original version, as you can see by the Smash Bros. Logo. This is the re-released Smash Bros. Ultimate version. I gotta say, there's a reason why the GameCube controller is still being used on Smash Bros. Tournaments today. Because it's just such a well-made controller. It's so comfortable. All the buttons are just right there, right at your fingertips. The buttons feel perfect. Not too mushy, but not too clunky either. It's just a great controller. Although, screw the D-pad. The D-pad's not all that great. Other than that, it's a fantastic controller. One of my favorites. And here are my games. I don't have a lot of GameCube games. It's one of my smallest collections. The reason why is because Nintendo GameCube games are very sought after nowadays, and some of them can be incredibly expensive, especially the first-party Nintendo titles. But because the GameCube has a really good homebrew and modding community, I might end up getting one of those SD card adapters and just running GameCube ISOs off of that to save some money. Because I am not willing to spend upwards of $100 to $200 for frickin' Luigi's Mansion or Super Mario Sunshine. That's just way too much. Starting off, we have Wave Race Blue Storm. This is actually a sequel to Wave Race on the Nintendo 64. I haven't played much of this game, but from what I played, it's actually pretty fun. This was also a launch title for the GameCube. I do recommend it. It's actually pretty fun. SSX On Tour. Not very many people actually talk about this one. I have no idea why. Because, in my opinion, SSX On Tour is a great SSX game. It's not the best one, but it's still really, really good. Plus, the GameCube version allows you to play as Peach, Mario, and Luigi. Can you do that on PS2 or Xbox? I don't think so. I would pick up the GameCube version just for that reason. And you can't have a GameCube without having Super Smash Bros. Melee. This is my favorite fighting game of all time. It is super well made, and I am so glad to have a copy because this game is incredibly expensive nowadays. What else can I say about Smash Bros. That hasn't been said already? It's... yeah. Namco Museum 50th anniversary. I am a sucker for Namco arcade games. I absolutely love them. And this one has a pretty good selection, 14 games in all. This version of Namco Museum also has an official 80s soundtrack with many hits such as Come On Eileen, Working for the Weekend, and plenty of other classic songs. And finally, one of my favorite racing games of all time, as well as my favorite Need for Speed game of all time, Need for Speed Underground. I played a crazy amount of this game growing up. It is so well made. Most people say Need for Speed Underground 2 is better, but honestly, this is going to sound like heresy. Bear with me. I think the first one's actually better. I have no idea why. I just had a much better time with Underground 1 than I did with Underground 2. Give this one a go. It doesn't matter what version you play, you're going to have a great time. Okay, I think it's time to show off some gameplay. Let's go. Alright, we got everything all plugged in. Here we go. Another one of my favorite startups. And unlike the PS2, the GameCube is surprisingly quiet. It's not whisper quiet, but it's at least it's a lot quieter. So just like I mentioned in the last review video, I don't have a capture card, so we'll have to suffice with pointing the camera at the screen to get gameplay, unfortunately. And also, I only have composite video cables for my GameCube, so we can't get 480p out of this thing, unfortunately, so this is the best that I can do. So here's the main menu of the Nintendo GameCube with this ominous cube swerving back and forth. I was always mesmerized by this main menu when I was younger. It was just so cool, and listen to that very calming music in the background. It's just very serene, you know? Also, fun fact. The music that plays on this menu is the Famicom Disk System startup sound, just really slowed down, which is a nice Easter egg. Also, another cool Easter egg is with the GameCube startup. If you hold down the Z button on the controller while the GameCube is starting up, you'll get a different startup tone. And if you do the same exact thing with 4 controllers at once, you'll get another tone while the GameCube is starting up, which I think it's like a jungle beat of some sort, which I don't have 4 controllers to show that off, but there's plenty of videos online showing that. So we have 4 options on this swaying cube. We got gameplay, calendar, memory card, and options. Memory card is basically our memory management. Pretty self-explanatory. Options is basically where we can set our sound settings as well as the screen position. Pretty standard stuff. Calendar is where we change our date and time, which, oh my god, yeah, that date's that date is way off. Oh well, we'll leave it alone for now. And finally, gameplay is where you actually start the game, if there's a disc in the system, which there is none right now. Not a whole lot of options, but it gets the job done. So like I mentioned earlier in the video, the GameCube controller just feels really nice in the hands. All the buttons are just right where they need to be, easy to reach, and what can I say, it's just a nice feeling controller. And playing a game like Super Smash Bros. Melee, you need to have a good controller. You can't have a controller that has shitty buttons, otherwise, well, it makes playing the game quite difficult. And luckily the GameCube controller has some really nice buttons. They're not too mushy, but not too clunky either. They feel just right. The controller also has pretty decent rumble as well. It's not as violent as the PS2's controller, but you can definitely feel that it's there, and that's the most important thing. I have this third-party Yobo branded GameCube controller, and that controller has some pretty weak rumble. It's the one thing I don't like about it. But this one, since it's an official controller, it just feels right, you know? If there's one minor gripe that I have to say about the controller, it's the analog sticks. Not the sticks themselves, but on the actual controller itself, they have little indentations for each of the 8 directions for the controller. And compared to the Xbox and PS2 controllers, which don't have those, it just feels kind of weird, especially when you're trying to rotate the stick really fast. Those indentations kind of get in the way. But it's only a minor gripe. It doesn't really detract from the experience. Playing a game like Galaga 88 is a good way of showing off the D-pad on the controller. And it's not the worst feeling D-pad I've ever felt, but it's not a great D-pad either. It's basically the exact same as the Game Boy Advance's D-pad, but for some reason, unlike the Game Boy Advance's D-pad, this one feels really mushy. I'm not entirely sure why they couldn't have just made it feel like the Game Boy Advance's D-pad, but I mean, yeah, I have no idea why it's so mushy. Like I said before, it's not the worst D-pad I've ever used though. But luckily, most games on the GameCube don't necessarily need to use the D-pad, so only a minor gripe. Let's talk about the analog triggers on the GameCube controller. Yes, they are indeed analog, and playing a game like Need for Speed Underground is a good example of showing those off. They don't come anywhere close to the analog triggers on the Xbox controller, but at least they're analog, and that's a good thing, especially in a racing game. So the GameCube's triggers work a little different compared to the Xbox's triggers. It basically works with partial press and full press. Partial press is, say for example, I press it down halfway and I don't want to go so fast. That's a partial press. If I press it down all the way, you'll hear a clicking sound and that registers as a full press. Like I said, I would much prefer regular triggers like the Xbox controller because I feel like they have a lot more range of movement. But these ones work well enough, and that's the most important thing. And so, there you have it. That was the Nintendo GameCube. It may not have sold as well as Nintendo would have hoped, but it is still a fantastic console. If you're thinking about getting into the GameCube's library, now's the time, because most of the GameCube's best games, especially the first-party ones, are just going to continue to increase in price. But luckily, prices of games haven't really had a big effect on the GameCube's prices online. GameCube consoles themselves are very common and pretty cheap nowadays. You can pick up the original Indigo or even the black or silver version of the GameCube for fairly cheap. Usually they go for around 50 to 70 bucks online just for the console itself. There is one big thing to consider if you want to pick up a GameCube, and that's the Wii. The Wii is fully backwards compatible with GameCube controllers, memory cards, and games. So for some, it might be easier just to use a Wii to play GameCube games. But to others, there's still some appeal of playing GameCube games on the actual console. So, I thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time.